The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged peaks surrounding Prescott, as Colonel Ethan Mitchell guided his horse along the steep mountain trail. The warm September breeze carried the metallic tang of copper mines mixing with pine, a scent that had become familiar in the 6 months since he'd arrived in Arizona territory. His weathered face remained impassive, but his gray eyes constantly scanned the terrain, old military habits that hadn't faded in the 5 years since Appomattox. The steady rhythm of construction echoed through the valley below, hammers striking rail spikes, dynamite blasts clearing the way for the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad's westward push. Mitchell's fingers unconsciously traced the folded papers in his coat pocket, documents that had led him here after years of searching. The names of 3 Union officers who'd ordered the burning of his family's Georgia plantation in '64. Captain Benjamin Turner, Lieutenant Alexander Phillips, and Major Jacob Roberts. His homestead had been far from the front lines, no strategic value to speak of. But Turner's raiders had come anyway, torching the main house while his wife Helen and young daughter Alice slept. Mitchell had been away fighting with Johnston's army near Atlanta. By the time he'd returned, there was nothing left but ashes and 2 small graves beneath the magnolia trees. The war's end hadn't diminished his need for vengeance. It had only forced him to be more patient. The railroad survey maps had finally given him what he needed. Turner was here, working as the head engineer for the A&P line. Phillips had a claim in the copper mines south of town. And Roberts. The intelligence suggested he'd set up a medical practice in Prescott under an assumed name. Mitchell had tracked them across 5 states, watching as they built new lives while the ruins of his own gathered dust back in Georgia. A rhythmic clanging drew his attention to a group of Chinese laborers laying track below, their foreman shouting instructions in pidgin English. Among them stood a tall figure Mitchell recognized instantly. Benjamin Turner, still ramrod straight in his work clothes, though his dark hair had gone mostly gray. Mitchell's hand drifted toward his revolver before he caught himself. Not yet. He needed all 3 of them together. The revenge he'd waited years to exact demanded nothing less. In Prescott, he found lodging at the Pioneer Hotel, carefully maintaining his cover as a mining investor examining prospects in the area. The desk clerk, a chatty widow named Frances Turner, proved to be an excellent source of local information. Yes, she knew Alexander Phillips, owned one of the larger copper operations south of town. And the doctor everyone spoke so highly of? That would be Noah Clark, though she'd heard he'd come from back east originally. Mitchell spent the next few days establishing his routine, making the rounds between saloons and mining offices while gathering intelligence. Phillips was easy to track. He visited his mines daily, riding out at dawn and returning at dusk. The doctor proved more elusive, his practice taking him all over the growing town. But Turner was the key. As chief engineer, he coordinated the entire railroad operation. Where he went, the others would eventually follow. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Word spread through town of a typhoid outbreak at the railroad workers' camp. Mitchell watched from the shadows as Dr. Clark hurried past, his medical bag in hand. The physician's face had aged, but Mitchell would never forget those features. Major Jacob Roberts, who'd given the order to burn his home while his family slept. His trigger finger itched, but he held back. Patience had gotten him this far. That evening, he overheard Turner and Phillips discussing an urgent meeting at the doctor's office after hours. Some crisis with the railroad construction that required all 3 men's attention. Mitchell smiled grimly as he cleaned his revolver in his hotel room. 5 years of searching, of following cold trails and false leads, had finally led to this moment. By tomorrow, justice would be served, or so he thought, before a commotion in the street below his window changed everything. The commotion drew Mitchell to the window, where he witnessed a scene that made his blood run cold. A wagon had overturned near the doctor's office, spilling several bodies onto the dusty street. Even from his vantage point, he could see they were railroad workers, their faces ashen and bodies racked with the telltale symptoms of typhoid. Dr. Clark, no, Major Roberts, was already there, directing townspeople to help carry the sick men into his clinic. The mountain air grew thick with panic as more wagons arrived from the railroad camp. Mitchell watched as Roberts worked tirelessly, his sleeves rolled up, moving from patient to patient with practiced efficiency. It was a far cry from the brutal officer who'd orchestrated the destruction of Mitchell's world that night in Georgia. The doctor's hands, once used to signal the torch-bearing soldiers forward, now pressed cool cloths to burning foreheads. Through the clinic's windows, Mitchell observed Roberts consulting medical texts by lamplight, scribbling notes, and mixing remedies well past midnight. The planned meeting with Turner and Phillips had clearly been forgotten in the chaos. Mitchell's carefully laid trap would have to wait. He told himself it was merely a tactical delay, not a moment of weakness. Yet something gnawed at him as he watched Roberts work himself to exhaustion, trying to save lives. Dawn broke over the craggy peaks surrounding Prescott, painting the mining town in shades of amber and rose. Mitchell had dozed fitfully in a chair by the window, his revolver still within reach. The epidemic had grown worse overnight. He could hear the doctor's voice carrying across the street, instructing volunteers on proper sanitation procedures. The authority in his tone reminded Mitchell of that night, but now it was being used to organize healing rather than destruction. A child's cry pierced the morning air, a sound that always transported Mitchell back to his daughter's final moments. But this time, the wail came from a very much alive little girl being carried toward the clinic by her frantic mother. Roberts met them at the door, and Mitchell found himself holding his breath as the doctor examined the child. The gentle way Roberts handled the frightened girl seemed at odds with the man who'd shown no mercy to Mitchell's own family. The mining community's response to the crisis revealed the degree of respect Roberts had earned. Rough-handed prospectors and weather-beaten ranchers brought food and supplies to the clinic. The local mining company sent clean water and fresh linens. Even the Apache scouts, who occasionally traded in town, contributed medicinal herbs. Mitchell had imagined finding a monster, but instead discovered a man who'd built a life around redemption. As the sun climbed higher, Mitchell holstered his revolver and made his way downstairs. The hotel keeper was organizing a group of volunteers, and Mitchell found himself joining them. He told himself he was merely maintaining his cover, getting closer to his target. But when he entered the clinic and saw Roberts performing what looked like a miracle, bringing a dying man back from the brink, the weight of his vengeance began to shift. The doctor barely glanced at Mitchell as he handed him clean bandages to distribute. This close, Mitchell could see the lines of exhaustion etched deeply in Roberts' face, so different from the arrogant young officer who'd destroyed everything Mitchell held dear. The man before him had aged not just in years but in wisdom, his hands now instruments of healing rather than harm. For the first time in 5 years, Mitchell's purpose wavered. Working alongside Roberts through the day, Mitchell witnessed dozens of small acts of compassion. The doctor remembered every patient's name, spoke softly to the frightened, and celebrated even minor improvements. When a miner's wife brought her husband's savings to pay for treatment, Roberts waved it away, saying only, "Use it to feed your children while he recovers." It was becoming harder for Mitchell to reconcile this man with the monster in his memories. As the sun dipped behind the Prescott Mountains, casting long shadows across the makeshift hospital tent, Mitchell found himself helping Roberts prepare medicine for the night shift. The bitter scent of willow bark tea mingled with the sharper notes of carbolic acid, a constant reminder of the battle they fought against the typhoid outbreak. The railroad construction camp sprawled below them, its usual bustle now subdued by illness and fear. Through the canvas walls came the rhythmic sound of hammers on steel, the healthy workers still laying track even as their companions fought for life. Mitchell had planned to use the chaos of the epidemic as cover for his revenge, but now each passing hour made his carefully laid plans feel like relics from another life. He watched as Roberts gently lifted a delirious young tracklayer's head, helping him sip water with the same hands that had once held a torch to Mitchell's home. "The fever's breaking in most of the western tent," Roberts said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "But we're losing ground with the new cases from Globe." He rubbed his temples, leaving a smudge of iodine across his forehead. Mitchell found himself automatically reaching for a clean cloth to hand him, the gesture of aid coming before he could stop himself. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Mitchell felt the calluses that now marked the doctor's hands. So different from the smooth-palmed officer he'd been. A commotion outside drew them both to the tent's entrance. A wagon had arrived from the mining camp near Flagstaff, bearing 3 more sick workers. The sight of their gray faces and trembling limbs sparked something in Roberts, who squared his shoulders and moved with renewed purpose. "We'll need more willow bark," he said, already striding toward the wagon, "and heat those blankets by the stove." Mitchell found himself following orders before he'd even processed them. As they worked together to settle the new patients, Mitchell observed how the other volunteers deferred to Robert's quiet authority. The late autumn winds whipped across the jagged peaks surrounding Prescott as Colonel Ethan Mitchell surveyed the railroad construction site from horseback. His weathered fingers traced the old burn scars on his neck, a constant reminder of the night Union soldiers had torched his Georgia plantation. 3 years of tracking had led him here, following whispers of Alexander Turner, the Union captain who'd commanded that raid. The railroad's westward march through Apache territory had drawn all manner of men seeking fortune or escape from their pasts. Below in the valley, crews of Chinese laborers and Irish immigrants hammered spikes and laid rails under the watchful eye of armed guards. The Turner Mining and Railroad Company had secured the contract to connect Prescott to Flagstaff, cutting through sacred tribal lands and some of the richest silver deposits in the territory. Mitchell had taken work as a security consultant, knowing it would put him close to his quarry. Benjamin Roberts, the site foreman, approached on foot, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. "Colonel, we've got trouble brewing with them Apache scouts again. Claim we're desecrating burial grounds." Mitchell nodded curtly. The tribal tensions served his purposes. The more chaos along the line, the easier it would be to strike at Turner without arousing suspicion. But Roberts' next words caught him off guard. "Doc Turner's headed up from Globe to treat our typhoid cases. Train's due tomorrow." The name sent Mitchell's pulse racing. Alexander Turner had reinvented himself as a physician after the war, building a reputation for treating both settlers and natives without prejudice. The transformation galled Mitchell, that his family's murderer now played at being a healer. Yet something in him hesitated at the thought of killing a doctor in the midst of an epidemic. The war had stripped away so much of his humanity. Did he dare lose what little remained? Francis Mitchell's dying screams still haunted his dreams, his wife's final moments as flames consumed their home. Their daughter Helen had been only 6, too young to understand why the men in blue coats were so angry. Turner had ordered the raid personally, claiming Confederate sympathizers were stockpiling weapons. It had been a lie, an excuse for plunder. Mitchell's fingers tightened on his reins until his knuckles went white. That evening, Mitchell sat alone in the railroad company's makeshift saloon, nursing a whiskey as he listened to the workers' gossip. Noah Phillips, a young surveyor, was telling anyone who'd listen about Doc Turner's heroics during a cholera outbreak in Yuma. Treated hundreds without rest, saved most of them too, never asked for a penny neither. The admiration in the boy's voice made Mitchell's stomach turn. If they only knew the blood on those healing hands. Clara Perez, who ran the saloon with her husband Jacob, set a fresh bottle before Mitchell. "You look troubled, Colonel." Her dark eyes held too much perception for comfort. Mitchell forced a wan smile. "Just memories, ma'am." She nodded knowingly. Everyone in these parts carried ghosts from the war, but few bore the weight of such specific vengeance. Clara hesitated, then added softly, "Doc Turner saved my boy last spring. Fever would have taken him otherwise." The night deepened, bringing no clarity to Mitchell's thoughts. He'd tracked Turner for 3 years, sustained by hatred and righteous fury. Now fate had delivered his enemy into his hands, but tangled up in circumstances that made simple revenge feel suddenly complicated. The typhoid epidemic was spreading through the rail camps, claiming lives daily. Would killing their only doctor make him any better than Turner had been? A commotion outside drew Mitchell to the window. Torches moved through the darkness. Apache riders, their faces painted for war. The railroad's encroachment had pushed them to the breaking point. Mitchell watched as Benjamin Roberts organized the guards, knowing the coming clash would provide perfect cover for murder. Yet he found himself wondering if Turner's medical skills might prove more valuable than his death in the days ahead. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks blood red. Mitchell saddled his horse, still undecided. The train whistle echoed through the valley. Turner would arrive within the hour. In his saddlebags, Mitchell carried both his old Confederate revolver and a letter from Clara describing the doctor's good works. Justice and mercy warred in his heart as hoofbeats approached from the south. The time for choosing had come. The approaching riders materialized through the morning haze, but it wasn't Turner's party. A band of Apache warriors swept down from the ridgeline, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls. Mitchell wheeled his horse around, watching as the railroad camp erupted into chaos. Benjamin Roberts' guards scrambled to defensive positions while workers fled toward the relative safety of the rail cars. Mitchell's military instincts took over. He spurred his mount toward the camp's makeshift hospital tent, where he knew several men lay critically ill with typhoid. The Apache raiders wouldn't distinguish between combatants and patients. As he approached, he saw Helen, the camp nurse, struggling to help a delirious man to safety. Without hesitation, Mitchell dismounted to assist, his revenge temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate danger. The sound of gunfire mixed with the thunder of hooves as Robert's men engaged the raiders. Mitchell helped Helen move two more patients, his shoulders burning with the effort. The third man they carried was Noah, a young track layer who'd shown Mitchell kindness during his weeks of surveillance. The boy's skin burned with fever as they dragged him behind a rocky outcropping. "The medicine wagon is due with Dr. Turner," Helen said breathlessly, pressing a damp cloth to Noah's forehead. "These men won't survive without those supplies." Mitchell's jaw tightened at Turner's name, but he found himself scanning the southern trail, hoping to spot the doctor's approaching wagon. The irony wasn't lost on him, now praying for the survival of the man he'd come to kill. A piercing war whoop drew Mitchell's attention to the ridge above them. 3 Apache warriors had broken through the guards line, heading straight for their position. Mitchell drew his revolver, not the Confederate weapon he'd brought for Turner, but his newer Colt. Helen clutched Noah protectively as Mitchell took aim. The first warrior fell from his horse, then the second. The third veered away, disappearing into a cloud of dust. Through the settling haze, Mitchell spotted a wagon approaching at breakneck speed. He recognized Turner at the reins, pushing his team dangerously fast along the rough trail. 2 Apache riders pursued him, arrows flying past the doctor's head as he swerved and ducked. Without conscious thought, Mitchell raised his Colt again. His first shot went wide, but the second found its mark. One warrior tumbled from his horse, the other pulled up and retreated. Turner's wagon skidded to a stop near their position, medical supplies rattling in the back. The doctor jumped down, medical bag already in hand, seemingly unfazed by his near-death experience. His eyes met Mitchell's for a moment, a stranger's grateful glance, unaware of their deeper connection. Mitchell felt the weight of his Confederate revolver in its holster, pressing against his ribs like an accusation. "Thank God you're here," Helen said, leading Turner to Noah's side. "The fever's gotten worse." Mitchell watched as the doctor immediately began his examination, his movements efficient and gentle. This was the man who'd helped burn Mitchell's world to ash during the war? The hands that had once held a torch now carefully measured medicine, soothing the sick with quiet words of comfort. The Apache attack had largely subsided, though sporadic gunfire still echoed through the valley. Benjamin Roberts was organizing men to strengthen the camp's defenses, expecting another raid at nightfall. Mitchell found himself automatically offering tactical suggestions, falling into his old role as a military commander. Roberts listened respectfully, unaware he was taking advice from a man who'd once fought against the Union. As the sun climbed higher, Mitchell watched Turner work tirelessly among the sick. The doctor's wagon had arrived just in time. Without the fresh medical supplies, several men would likely have died before sunset. Mitchell's hand strayed to his Confederate revolver, then fell away. The choice he'd come to make was becoming more complex with each passing hour. Justice seemed less clear in the harsh light of day, mercy less like weakness. In the distance, smoke rose from several points along the railroad line, other camps under attack. Turner was already repacking his wagon, preparing to risk the dangerous trail again to reach them. Mitchell found himself moving to help, loading supplies and checking the horses. The doctor's quiet dedication to saving lives stood in stark contrast to the violence surrounding them. How much of the war's horror had been like this? Good men on both sides caught in currents of history beyond their control. As Mitchell helped Turner secure the last of the medical supplies, a rider appeared through the shimmering heat waves, his horse lathered and heaving. It was Jacob, one of the railroad surveyors Mitchell had met in Prescott. The man's usual neat appearance was disheveled, his face streaked with dust and worry. "Doc Turner." The camp at Eagle Pass is overrun with fever. They've lost 15 men already and more are falling sick by the hour. Turner's weathered face tightened as he processed the news. He turned to Mitchell with unexpected authority. "I need an extra pair of hands. The trail's dangerous, and I can't tend patients and watch my back at the same time. It wasn't a request. Mitchell found himself nodding, though the irony of protecting a man he'd come to kill wasn't lost on him. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the relative safety of the camp behind. The mountain trail wound treacherously between steep cliffs and abandoned mine shafts, evidence of earlier prospectors' dreams scattered like broken teeth along the ridges. Mitchell rode ahead, scanning for both raiders and shortcuts. The late autumn wind howled through the narrow mountain passes outside Prescott as Colonel Ethan Mitchell stood at the edge of the railroad camp, his weathered hands gripping the railing of the newly constructed platform. Below him, dozens of workers laid track through the rugged terrain, their hammers striking a rhythmic chorus against steel rails that would soon connect the mining operations to the main line. But Mitchell's thoughts weren't on the railroad's progress. They were fixed on Dr. Benjamin Turner, the Union Army surgeon who now ran the town's only medical clinic. Through his brass spyglass, Mitchell could see Turner's clinic from his vantage point, watching as the doctor hurried between beds of typhoid patients. The same hands that had once held a torch to Mitchell's plantation now worked tirelessly to save lives. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the growing unease in his gut as he contemplated his next move. His fingers unconsciously traced the old burn scars on his neck. A permanent reminder of that night 5 years ago. The railroad camp buzzed with activity as Foreman Jacob Roberts approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Colonel, we've got trouble at the East Tunnel. Cave-in trapped 3 men. Mitchell nodded grimly, knowing what this meant. They'd need Turner's help. The doctor was the only one skilled enough to handle such injuries, and Mitchell's carefully laid plans for revenge would have to wait. The railroad's progress and men's lives had to come first. "Send for Turner," Mitchell ordered, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "And get Anna Phillips up here too. She knows these tunnels better than anyone." The young mining engineer had proven invaluable in recent months, her expertise with the treacherous mountain geology saving countless lives. Mitchell watched as Roberts dispatched a rider toward town, the horse's hooves kicking up dust along the newly graded railbed. In the medical clinic, Dr. Turner wiped sweat from his brow as he checked on Frances Perez, the station master's wife who lay delirious with fever. He hadn't recognized Mitchell when the colonel first arrived in town 3 months ago to oversee the railroad's expansion. Years of guilt and laudanum had clouded many memories of the war. But Turner knew there was something hauntingly familiar about the scarred man who watched him from afar. The messenger burst through the clinic door, gasping news of the cave-in. Turner grabbed his medical bag without hesitation, his mind already racing through possible injuries and treatments. As he mounted his horse, he caught a glimpse of Mitchell standing on the platform above the camp. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Turner felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something in Mitchell's gaze spoke of a reckoning long delayed. Anna Phillips was already at the tunnel entrance when Turner arrived, her oil lamp casting long shadows as she directed the rescue effort. She'd worked these mines since she was 16, following in her father's footsteps after his death in a similar cave-in. "The support beams gave way about 50 feet in," she explained, pointing to her hastily drawn diagram. "We can hear them calling, but the whole section's unstable." Mitchell watched the rescue unfold, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. He could end Turner right now. One shot in the confusion and chaos would go unquestioned. But as he saw the doctor crawl fearlessly into the unstable tunnel to reach the trapped men, Mitchell's finger eased off the trigger. The memories of his burning home and screaming family warred with the scene before him. Turner risking his own life to save others. The rescue took hours, with Turner making multiple trips into the tunnel to stabilize and extract the injured workers. Each time he emerged, covered in dust and blood, Mitchell's resolve weakened further. He remembered Turner's face by firelight 5 years ago, but now he saw it by lamplight, focused and determined to preserve life rather than destroy it. The contradiction tore at him, challenging everything that had driven him these past years. As dawn approached, the last injured man was carried out. Turner slumped against a support beam, exhausted but successful. All 3 workers would live. Mitchell approached slowly, his boots scraping on the rocky ground. Turner looked up, and recognition finally dawned in his tired eyes. "Colonel Mitchell," he said quietly, "I've been wondering when you'd come for me." The words hung in the cold morning air between them, heavy with shared history and unspoken guilt. Anna Phillips watched the 2 men from nearby, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. She'd grown to respect both Mitchell and Turner over the past months, the colonel for his fair treatment of the workers, and the doctor for his tireless dedication to the community. Now she saw something dark pass between them, like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Mitchell's hand stayed near his gun as Turner slowly stood. "Your family," the doctor said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think about them every day. The war. It changed us all into monsters at times. I've spent years trying to atone." He reached into his bag and withdrew a worn leather journal. "Their names are all here. Every person I couldn't save, and every life I destroyed. Your wife Helen, your daughters Clara and Alice, they're on the first page." The journal landed in the dirt between them, its pages splayed open like broken wings. Mitchell stared at it, seeing his family's names written in Turner's careful hand. The revenge he'd nursed for 5 years crystallized into this moment. But instead of the satisfaction he'd imagined, he felt only a profound weariness. The railroad workers moved around them, continuing their labor as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis for two men standing in its midst. The distant clanging of hammer on rail spike punctuated the silence as Mitchell's fingers traced the edge of his holster. Behind Turner, smoke rose from the railroad workers' camp, mingling with the dust kicked up by the continuing construction. The doctor remained motionless, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his confession, while the mountain winds whipped around them both. "You think this makes it right?" Mitchell's voice cracked like dry timber. "Writing their names in a book while you build your new life?" He took a step forward, boots crunching on loose gravel. The workers had begun to notice the tension, their movements slowing as they cast furtive glances toward the two men. Turner shook his head, reaching slowly into his medical bag again. "No, nothing makes it right, but there's something else you should see." He withdrew a yellowed envelope, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. "Your wife Helen, she gave me this the night of the raid. She knew what was coming, made me swear to deliver it if anything happened." Mitchell's hand trembled as he took the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Helen's flowing script, the paper fragile with age. "My dearest," it began, "if you're reading this, then war has taken me from you. Don't let it take your soul as well." The words blurred as moisture gathered in Mitchell's eyes. A commotion from the workers' camp interrupted the moment, shouts of alarm and the sound of running feet. "Dr. Turner," a voice called out. "It's Noah. The fever's taken a turn." The doctor's face twisted in conflict, torn between his past and his present duty. Mitchell watched as Turner's gaze darted between him and the camp. The revenge he'd pursued across 3 territories suddenly felt hollow, like a mine shaft stripped of ore. In Helen's letter, her final words echoed, "Remember the man I loved, who showed mercy even to those who wronged him. Go," Mitchell said, his voice rough as uncut stone. "Go save him." He tucked the letter into his vest, next to his heart. Turner hesitated for a moment, then grabbed his medical bag and hurried toward the camp, leaving the journal still lying in the dust. The sun had begun its descent behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the railroad cuts. Mitchell walked to where the journal lay and picked it up, its weight somehow both lighter and heavier than he'd expected. Pages of names, dates, and locations documented Turner's journey from soldier to healer. In the distance, he could hear Turner calling for hot water and clean bandages. The doctor's voice carried the same urgency it must have had on battlefield hospitals, trying to save lives instead of taking them. Mitchell thought of Clara and Alice, how they'd wanted to be nurses before the war took their future away. As darkness settled over the camp, Mitchell made his way to his horse. The journal he placed in his saddlebag, not as evidence for revenge, but as testament to how war could destroy and transform men's souls. Behind him, lanterns began to glow in the workers' tents, and the sound of prayer mixed with the evening wind. Tomorrow, the railroad would continue its inexorable push westward, binding the nation's wounds with iron and steam. Mitchell turned his horse toward Prescott, where he'd heard his old friend Jacob had settled. Perhaps it was time to build something instead of tearing down, to honor Helen's memory not with vengeance but with the mercy she'd asked for in her final words. The mountain peaks stood silent witness as Mitchell rode away, leaving behind both the man he'd been and the revenge he'd thought would heal him. In his vest, Helen's letter pressed against his heart, guiding him toward a future he hadn't imagined possible when he'd first tracked Turner to this remote railroad camp. The final confrontation between Colonel Ethan Mitchell and Dr. Benjamin Turner unfolded not with gunfire, but amid the chaos of Prescott's overwhelmed typhoid ward. Mitchell stood in the doorway of the makeshift hospital, his weathered hand gripping his revolver as he watched Turner work tirelessly to save yet another feverish patient. The sounds of suffering echoed through the converted warehouse, a stark contrast to the vengeful silence Mitchell had imagined for this moment. Through the window, the hulking frame of the newly constructed railroad bridge cast long shadows across the room. That bridge, built with Turner's financial backing, had brought both progress and pestilence to the mountain mining town. Mitchell had tracked Turner here, following the railroad's expansion westward, only to find his sworn enemy had become the town's salvation. Frances Roberts, the young nurse who had first recognized Mitchell from his wanted posters, watched nervously from behind a screen of medicine bottles. She had promised Turner 3 days' grace to handle the epidemic before she alerted the authorities. Now, on the third day, she saw something unexpected in Mitchell's eyes as he observed the doctor's work. Not hatred, but confusion. The memories of his burning plantation still haunted Mitchell nightly, the screams of his wife Helen and daughter Alice as the flames consumed their home. He had spent 5 years tracking down each member of the Union Patrol responsible. Turner had been their commanding officer, the one who gave the order. But here was the same man, hands bloody from surgery rather than violence, fighting to save the children of miners and railroad workers alike. "I knew you'd come eventually," Turner said without looking up from his patient, a young boy racked with fever. "I've carried the weight of what we did to your family every day since. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. The intelligence was wrong. We thought your plantation was an arms depot, by the time we realized our mistake." He trailed off, continuing to work as he spoke. Mitchell's finger tightened on the trigger, then loosened. The boy on the table looked so much like his own son Jacob, lost in the fire. He watched as Turner's skilled hands worked to lower the child's fever, the same hands that had once signed the order that destroyed Mitchell's world. The complexity of his revenge had never felt more tangled. A commotion arose from the far end of the ward as another patient was brought in. Alexander Phillips, one of the railroad foremen, delirious with fever. His wife Clara clutched their infant son Noah, tears streaming down her face as Turner rushed to help. Mitchell found himself instinctively moving to assist, catching Phillips as he thrashed in his delirium. Through the long night, Mitchell stayed, first watching, then helping. He saw Turner work until he could barely stand, saw him weep when he lost patience and celebrate when others pulled through. The sun was rising over the mountainous horizon when Turner finally turned to face him directly. "I can't bring them back," Turner said softly, "but I can try to save others. That's all any of us can do now." Mitchell looked down at his hands, now stained with medicine rather than gunpowder. The weight of his revolver felt foreign after hours of passing bandages and holding cool compresses to fevered brows. In the pale morning light, he saw the faces of his lost family reflected in every patient he had helped save through the night. The railroad whistle echoed through the valley, signaling the arrival of another supply train. With it would come more medicine, more hope, and likely more sick. Mitchell slowly unbuckled his gun belt and laid it aside. "The boy you're treating," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "His fever's rising again." Turner nodded gratefully, and together they returned to work. Frances watched in amazement as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the two men working side by side to save lives. She quietly disposed of the telegram she'd written to the authorities. Outside, the mining town stirred to life, its people unaware of the profound battle that had been fought and won in their midst, not with bullets, but with mercy. As weeks passed, the epidemic gradually subsided. Mitchell remained in Prescott, using his military experience to help organize the town's medical response. The railroad bridge was completed, linking the mountain communities together. And in a small cemetery plot, Turner helped Mitchell erect modest markers for Helen, Alice, and Jacob Mitchell, a place where the past could finally rest. The town's newspaper, the Prescott Courier, later ran a story about the unlikely partnership between Dr. Turner and his new assistant, never knowing the full truth of their connection. Some nights, both men still woke from nightmares of fire and war, but they found a measure of peace in the lives they saved together. The railroad brought more changes to the mountain town, but none as profound as the transformation of two enemies into reluctant allies in the battle against death itself. As winter descended on Prescott, the town's transformation continued. The railroad tracks gleamed like silver ribbons against the snow-dusted mountains, and the once contentious construction site became a symbol of progress. Turner found himself drawn more frequently to the doctor's office, not as a reluctant patient, but as someone seeking understanding of a different kind of healing, one that went beyond physical wounds to touch the soul itself. One crisp December morning, Turner discovered an old Confederate battle flag among Mitchell's belongings while helping reorganize the clinic's storage room. His hands trembled as he held the weathered fabric, memories of burning plantations and battlefield horrors threatening to overwhelm him. But when Mitchell found him there, the expected confrontation never came. Instead, they spent hours talking about the war, not as enemies, but as men who had both lost too much to hatred. The railroad's completion brought new families to Prescott, including a young widow named Clara, who opened a schoolhouse near the depot. She noticed how the two men worked together, the former colonel and the doctor, their unlikely friendship becoming a testament to the town's own healing. When Turner finally shared his story with her one evening, she saw not the vengeful soldier he'd once been, but a man who'd chosen a harder path, the path of forgiveness. Spring arrived with an unexpected letter from Noah, Turner's former lieutenant, urging him to join a group of Confederate veterans planning raids on Union settlements. Turner's response, written late one night in Mitchell's office, was brief but resolute. "The war is over. Let it rest." He sealed the envelope knowing he'd finally buried more than just his family's memory. He'd laid to rest the man he'd been during those bitter years of conflict. Mitchell's practice grew as the town prospered, and Turner found himself increasingly involved in the medical work. His military experience with field medicine, combined with Mitchell's patient teaching, transformed him from an assistant into a skilled practitioner. Together, they established Prescott's first proper hospital, converting an abandoned mining office into a place of healing rather than profit. The summer brought both drought and forest fires to the mountains. When flames threatened the outlying homesteads, Turner and Mitchell worked side by side evacuating families and treating smoke inhalation. In those desperate hours, Turner realized that saving lives had become more important to him than avenging deaths. The smoke-filled skies reminded him of different fires, but now he was fighting to prevent destruction rather than cause it. As autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson, Clara's schoolhouse hosted a harvest festival. Turner watched as Mitchell taught the children about basic medicine, their small faces rapt with attention. Among them was a young boy named Alexander, whose father had died in the mine collapse the previous spring. Turner recognized in the child's eyes the same loss he'd carried for so long, and found himself sharing stories of hope rather than vengeance. The years that followed saw Prescott grow into a proper city, with the railroad bringing both prosperity and change. Turner never completely forgot the pain of his past, but he learned to carry it differently. He and Mitchell maintained separate practices but continued to work together during emergencies, their partnership becoming legendary among the townspeople who never knew its origins in blood and fire. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside the hospital windows, Turner sat with a dying Confederate veteran who'd recognized him from the war. The old soldier spoke of battles long past, but Turner gently steered the conversation toward the man's family, his life after the war, the legacy he'd leave behind. Mitchell, overhearing from the doorway, understood that both men had finally found what they'd been searching for. Not justice, but peace. The story of the colonel who came seeking revenge but stayed to heal became part of Prescott's unwritten history, whispered around fireplaces and passed down through generations. But only Turner and Mitchell knew the full truth. That sometimes the greatest battles are won, not through force of arms, but through the courage to lay them down. And that true healing comes not from settling old scores, but from learning to write new stories over the scars of the past.